At my husband's funeral, before the casseroles were even cold, his son stood in my living room with a drink in his hand and told a circle of relatives, loud enough for me to hear, that I had been Arthur's nurse those last few years, not his wife. That his mother had been Arthur's wife. And that now that Dad was gone, it was time I went back to wherever it was I'd come from and let the family have their mother's house back. I was standing 10 feet away, holding a tray of the little sandwiches I'd made that morning with my own hands, in the kitchen of the home I had lived in for 22 years. 22 years. And my stepson Gary said it the way you'd discuss a contractor who'd overstayed the job. The nurse, not the wife. Their mother's house. As if the 2 decades I'd spent loving his father, and the last 4 years I'd spent keeping that man alive and comfortable and clean and laughing when there wasn't much left to laugh about, had been a temporary position I'd been hired into and could now be dismissed from. What Gary did not know, as he stood in my living room, dividing up my life in front of the mourners, was something his father had done 2 years before he died. Something quiet, in a lawyer's office downtown, on an afternoon I drove him to without understanding why. By the time it came to light, the plan Gary and his sister were already building in their heads to contest the will and put me out and take back what they called their mother's house was going to come apart in their hands so completely that there'd be nothing left to say. Because Arthur had seen this coming. Arthur had known his own children, and from somewhere past the grave, my husband had already made sure I would never, not for one single day, have to prove to anyone that I had been his wife. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Sylvia. I'm 70 years old, and I live in a stone house on a hill in a small town in eastern Pennsylvania. The kind of town with a church on every other corner and hills that turn the color of a hearth fire every October. For most of my life, I made my living at a keyboard. I was the organist at our church for 31 years, and I taught piano in my front room to 2 generations of this town's children. So that even now, I can't walk through the grocery without some grown man with grey at his temples telling me I taught him Für Elise when he was 9. And badly, he'll add, and we'll both laugh. Music was my whole life, until love came late and gave me a second one. There is something my husband asked of me the last good week of his life, something I didn't understand at the time. He had me drive him downtown to see a woman named Connie Alvarez, and he made me wait in the car. And on the way home, he took my hand and made me promise him something strange. And I promised, the way you promise a dying man anything, without understanding. I understand it now. It is the reason I'm telling you this from my own front room, with my own piano behind me, instead of from some apartment across town. But you have to know the whole of it first, because the whole of it is what makes the end of it mean anything. I married Arthur when I was 48 and he was 56. Late for both of us. I had never married at all. I'd given my young years to my mother, who was sick a long time and needed me, and then to the church and my students. And I had made a quiet peace with the quiet, the way a woman does when she decides the big love simply isn't going to be part of her portion in this life. I had my music. I told myself my music was enough, and most days it was. And then Arthur walked into the back of the church one Sunday in autumn, a widower of 2 years, a big, shy, grieving man who didn't know what to do with his hands. And he started staying after the service to listen to me practice. He didn't say anything for weeks. He'd just sit in the last pew while I ran my scales and worked through the next Sunday's hymns. And then he'd nod and go, "It took that man a year and a half to work up the nerve to ask me to supper. His first wife, Carol, the mother of his children, had died of a hard cancer. And he had loved her, and I never once in 22 years asked him to pretend otherwise. I was not a replacement for Carol. I never tried to be, and I think that's the very thing that let it work. I was something else, a second spring, the thing that comes green and astonishing when you'd long since stopped expecting anything to come at all. Those were good years. I want to dwell on them a moment, because the good years are the credit that the cruelty later tried to bankrupt. We travelled a little, finally, the two of us, the things he'd never done. He'd come home from the hardware store with sheet music he couldn't read, just because the cover was pretty and he wanted to hear me play it. He learned to turn pages for me. I learned to bait a hook. We were not young, and it was not fireworks. It was better than fireworks. It was two people who'd each given up on this particular happiness, handing it to each other late, and knowing exactly what it was worth because we'd done so long without it. 22 years. People who marry at 20 don't always understand what 22 years means to people who married at 48. It was the whole back half of my life. It was everything. Let me stop a moment here, because I've been talking a while, and it would do my heart good to know who's sitting with me tonight. Wherever you are, whatever town, leave it down below where I can see it. A house gets very quiet after 50 years of practicing scales and 22 years of a good man's footsteps. And a little company, even company I can't see, means more than you'd think. There now, where was I? Arthur and his children. Arthur had 2 children with Carol. Gary, who was 19 when his mother died, and 21 when I came along. And Denise, who was 17. And I want to be fair to them here at the start, because grief does things to young people that they spend the rest of their lives not understanding. They had lost their mother, and no sooner had the ground settled over her than here came a church organist their father couldn't stop smiling at. I understood. I never pushed. I went slow, slower than slow. I never asked them to call me anything but Sylvia. I never sat in Carol's chair at the holidays. I learned which subjects to leave alone. And for a while, a long while, I thought we'd found our footing, the 3 of us. Careful, but real. Denise softened first, the way daughters sometimes do. There were years, when her own children were small, that she dropped them with us for whole weekends, and I taught her girl Emily to play, and that child would crawl up on the bench beside me, and we'd make a glorious racket together. And I loved her. I love her still, like she was my own blood. Gary stayed cooler, always. A careful handshake, a holiday phone call, but civil. And I told myself civil was a fine place to live. I did not understand, until his father was dying, that under that civility, Gary had been keeping a ledger all those years, and that on his ledger, I had never stopped being the woman who took his mother's place. Now let me tell you about the last 4 years, because this is the part that matters most. The part Gary stood in my living room and erased with one sentence. Arthur got sick the way strong men hate to. It started in his hands, a tremor he tried to hide from me at the supper table, and then his walk, and then the doctor said the word, and our life changed shape around it, the way a river changes shape around a stone. Parkinson's. The long, slow, undignified thievery of it. And I want to tell you what those 4 years actually were, in plain detail, because Gary called it nursing as though I'd clocked in and out, and I need you to know what it really was. It was getting up 3 and 4 times a night, every night, for years, to turn him, to help him to the bathroom, to calm him when the dreams the medicine gave him got bad, It was learning to crush his pills into applesauce when he couldn't swallow them whole anymore, and learning the exact schedule, the 7 different times a day, because if you were late, the tremor won and he couldn't so much as hold a cup. It was bathing a grown man with all the tenderness you'd give a baby, and protecting his dignity while you did it, never once letting him see in my face how it broke my heart. It was the afternoons his mind would cloud and he'd get frightened, and the only thing that brought him back was me sitting at the piano and playing the hymns he'd courted me listening to, so that some of the last clear words my husband ever spoke to me were, "Play it again, Syl." I played it again. I played it 10,000 times. That is what Gary called being the nurse and not the wife. I was both, and the being both nearly killed me, and I would do every single hour of it again. And where were Gary and Denise in those 4 years? Denise came when she could, I'll give her that. And she'd cry in my kitchen and tell me she didn't know how I did it, and she meant it. But Gary came twice a year, Christmas and Arthur's birthday. He'd sit for an hour with his coat still on, and he'd ask his father about the fillies, and he'd leave, and he never once, not one single time in 4 years, asked me how I was holding up, or sent a meal, or stayed a night so I could sleep. He sent money once, a check, when I mentioned hiring an aide a few hours a week, and he made sure to mention the check more than once after. Money is what you send instead of yourself. I learned that in those 4 years, the way you learn a foreign language, completely against your will. Arthur died on a Tuesday morning in March, at home, in our bed, with me holding his hand and the early light coming through the curtains he'd hung himself. He was peaceful at the end, and clear, clearer than he'd been in months. And the last thing he said to me, he squeezed my hand and he said, "You were the best thing, Syl. Don't let them tell you any different." I didn't know, then, that he was warning me. I thought he was just being sweet. I understand it now. They came for the funeral, and they were kind for about 3 days, the length of the casseroles. And then Carol's children remembered I was not Carol's, and the temperature in my own house dropped 40 degrees. It started the afternoon of the funeral, with Gary's sentence about the nurse and the wife, and going back where I came from. But that was only the beginning. The next morning, the 2 of them sat me down at my own kitchen table, the table where I'd crushed their father's pills for 4 years, and Gary laid it out like the businessman he is. The house, he informed me, had been their mother's house, bought when they were children, full of their mother's things, their childhood, their history. It was only right, he said, that it come back to the family now. He'd spoken to a lawyer. There was an old will from years back that he believed left things to be divided fairly among the children. And he was confident, he said, watching my face, that no court would see it any other way. He was prepared to be generous about giving me time. 60 days, he thought, was more than fair, to find myself a little place. A little place. To find myself a little place at 70, 60 days after I buried my husband, out of the home I had lived in and loved in and nursed a man to death in for 22 years. And it wasn't only inside the house. The word gold digger has a way of traveling. In a small town, once somebody with a grievance decides to set it loose. It came back to me the way these things do, second-hand, from a woman at the church who thought I ought to know what was being said. That I'd married Arthur for the house. That I'd kept his children away those last years to get him alone. That the devoted nursing was just a long performance for the will. I had played that church's organ for 31 years, christened half the town and buried the other half. And now I sat in my pew on Sunday, feeling eyes I'd known for decades slide off me and whisper. Gary even saw to it that my name was left out of the longer obituary the family placed in the city paper. The one that listed Arthur, survived by his children and grandchildren. As though the wife who closed his eyes had never existed at all. 22 years, erased from a paragraph. I have learned since that this is its own particular cruelty. To be disappeared while you're still standing right there. And then Denise started on the things. She didn't have Gary's stomach for the speeches, but she went through the house with that same quiet notepad I've seen before in my life, marking what had been Carol's, the good dishes, the dining set, a landscape painting Carol's father had done that hung in the hall. And then she came to the piano, my piano, that I had played at their father's bedside 10,000 times. And she said, gentle, almost apologetic, that actually the piano had been bought when she was a girl, that her mother used to play it, and that she thought it should go to Emily. To Emily, the granddaughter I taught on that very bench, as though I'd been borrowing it, as though I were the houseguest who'd finally, after 22 years, been caught taking liberties with the furniture. I have to be fair, even now, because the truth always has more than one room in it, and I saw something the second week that I have held on to. I came down one night and found Gary alone in the dark in the living room, sitting in front of the wall of family photographs. The old ones. Carol, young and laughing. The kids, small. And his shoulders were shaking. And for just a moment, the businessman was gone, and there was only a boy who'd lost his mother and was about to lose the last house she'd lived in, the last walls that remembered her. And I understood him then, all the way down. This was never really about me, or even about money. Not for Gary. It was about a grief he'd never set down, and a house that to him was the last living piece of his mother, and a stepmother who had the terrible nerve to still be in it, alive, when his mother was not. I understood. Understanding him did not mean I was going to let him put me out on the street, but it let me do later what I did without hating him, and that turned out to matter more than I knew. Denise, I think, was ashamed even then. She wouldn't meet my eyes through most of it. She let Gary do the talking, and she marked the dishes, and she went along, the way the softer ones go along, and that hurt in its own quiet way, because Denise, I had thought, was partly mine. That was the stretch when I stopped sleeping, though heaven knows I'd had little enough practice at sleeping those last 4 years. I'd lie awake in the bed where Arthur died and do a kind of arithmetic of the heart. 22 years, 4 years of nights, 10,000 hymns. And at the end of all of it, a 60-day notice and a daughter who wanted the piano. I started to believe them. That's the thing I most need you to hear. In the grief and the exhaustion and the loneliness, with no one in that house to tell me different, I started to believe that maybe Gary was right. Maybe I had been just the nurse. Maybe a woman who marries a man at 48 and never gives him children and never legally becomes a mother to his is something less than a real wife. Something with no real claim. Something that should be grateful for 60 days and go quietly. And I'll be honest with you, because this is the truest part, and it is not the part where I'm strong. I started to pack. I got the boxes down from the cellar, the flattened ones Arthur always saved, and I started in the music room. My music room. wrapping my mother's little china figurines in newspaper one by one. And the strange thing was how calm I felt doing it. The terrible calm of a woman who has decided to disappear. I had decided I would not fight. That fighting was undignified, beneath me, that a lady in my position simply withdrew with her chin up. That I would take my piano, if they'd even let me, and my clothes, and the few things that were plainly mine, and I would find a little place across town and vanish out of Carol's house and let Carol's children have it back. Because somewhere in that fog of grief and exhaustion, I had let them convince me that this was the right and natural order of things, that the first family was the real one, and I was the long interruption that was finally, properly ending. I taped a box shut. I wrote music on the side of it in marker, in my own hand, and I stood there looking at that word on that box. And I have never in my life felt so much like a guest who'd been asked to leave a party she thought was her own home. I was that close. I was one phone call to a moving company away from handing Carol's children every single thing my husband spent his last clear afternoon on earth trying to keep them from taking. And then I remembered the promise Arthur made me make, the last good week, on the way home from the office of the woman named Connie Alvarez. He'd held my hand in the car and he'd said, "Promise me something, Syl. When I'm gone, before you believe one word anybody tells you about that house, you go and see Connie. You sit down in her office and you let her tell you what we did. Promise me you'll go to her first." And I'd promised. And then he'd gotten sick so fast at the end that I'd forgotten it entirely. The way grief eats the days right before a death. But standing in that half-packed music room with a box of my mother's figurines taped shut, I remembered. And the next morning, instead of calling a moving company, I drove downtown to keep a promise to a dead man. I want to slow down here, because the hour in Connie Alvarez's office was the hour my whole life turned back over, and I had very nearly thrown it away in a packing box. Connie Alvarez was a calm, precise woman about my own age, and when I told her what Arthur's children were doing, she did not look surprised. She got up, and she went to a cabinet, and she took out a folder with my husband's careful handwriting on the tab. And she sat back down, and she said, "Sylvia, your husband came to me 2 years ago. He sat right where you're sitting, and he told me he knew exactly what his son would do the moment he was gone. He said, 'Gary's going to try to put Sylvia out and call it getting our mother's house back.' So we made sure he couldn't. And she explained it to me, slow, so I'd understand every piece. Years ago, Connie said, long before he was sick, Arthur had quietly changed how the house was owned. He had put it in both our names, mine and his, as what the law calls joint tenants with right of survivorship. I am not a lawyer, and she said it plainer for me, the way I'll say it for you. It meant that the house did not belong to Arthur alone. It belonged to the two of us together, as one thing. And the law said that the very instant one of us died, the whole of it belonged, automatically, completely, to the one still living. To me. Not through the will, around the will. The house had passed to me, free and clear and untouchable, in the same breath that Arthur took his last. It had never, not for 1 second after he died, been part of his estate at all. Gary could contest that old will from now until the end of time. He could win every word of it, and it would not get him one nail of this house, because this house had never been in the will to begin with. Arthur had seen to that. 2 years before, on a quiet afternoon, while his son was 300 miles away keeping his ledger. There was more. Connie slid an envelope across the desk. My name on it in Arthur's hand. The letters careful and a little shaky from the tremor that had already begun 2 years before when he wrote it. She said, "He left you this, told me to give it to you if his children ever made you doubt yourself. I'd say that day has come. I won't read you all of what my husband wrote. Some words a man leaves his wife stay between the two of them and the grave. But I'll tell you the heart of it, because the heart of it is the whole of this story. He wrote that he knew his children would call me a gold digger, and call me the nurse, and call this Carol's house, and that he was sorry for it, that he should have made them see me sooner, and never quite knew how. He wrote that he had loved Carol, truly, and that loving Carol had not made 1 inch less of room for loving me. Because the heart, he wrote, is not a house with only so many chairs." I had to set the letter down a moment when I read that line, because it was so exactly him. A hardware store man reaching for a thing he didn't have the schooling to say and saying it better than any poet. And then he wrote the line I have since set to memory like a hymn. He wrote, "A wife is not the one who got there first, or the one who shares the children's blood. A wife is the one who stays to the last breath. You stayed, Syl. You were my wife in the only way that ever counted, and the house knows it even if they never do. Keep it, and then, when you can, be kinder to them than they were to you, because they are mine too, and they are only breaking because they loved their mother. That's my last piano lesson for you. Play it gentle." I sat in that office and I wept. In front of that kind, precise woman. The first real weeping I'd let myself do since the funeral. Because I'd been too busy being put out of my own house to grieve the man I'd lost. Not from grief alone, then, and not even just then from relief. I wept from being seen. For 2 solid weeks, I had let Carol's children turn me into the nurse, the interloper, the house guest who'd finally overstayed. And my husband, reaching out from the far side of death with a folder and a letter and a quiet afternoon 2 years gone, had stood up out of the grave and said, plain as a struck chord, this is what she was. My wife, the one who stayed. I'd like to tell you there was a grand and terrible confrontation, but I'd promised Arthur to play it gentle, and gentle turned out to be far stronger than terrible. I had Connie Alvarez send Gary and Denise a simple letter with a copy of the deed, the one that showed the house had passed to me by law the moment their father died, and was no part of any estate to be divided or contested. I let the paper do the talking. Gary called me within the hour, and he was not cool and businesslike anymore. He shouted. He said it wasn't possible, that I'd tricked a sick old man, that he'd fight it. And I let him run all the way down, the way you let a chord ring out till it fades. And when he was finished, I said the only hard thing I said to him in the whole of it. I said, Gary, your father set this up 2 years before he passed, when his mind was sharp as yours and a good deal kinder. He did it because he knew, to the day, exactly what you'd try to do. And he loved you anyway. And he loved me enough to stop you. You're welcome to take that to a courthouse, but I think you already know what your father did, and why. And I don't think you want a judge explaining your own daddy's heart to you in front of a room. There was a long silence on the line. He did not take it to a courthouse. And then I did the thing Arthur asked of me in the letter. The thing that I believe now was the whole point of the letter. The last lesson. I did not keep Carol's things. I had Denise come back, just her, and I gave her every single item she'd marked on that notepad. The dishes, the dining set, her grandfather's painting. I packed them myself, carefully. And the music box of carols that had sat on my dresser for 22 years, that Arthur had given me and that I had always, privately, thought of as half carols anyway. I put that in Denise's hands and I closed her fingers over it. Not because she'd earned it that hard month. Because they were Carol's children and Arthur's children, and the things were rightly theirs. And keeping a dead woman's dishes to spite her grieving children is no kind of victory I ever wanted. I kept the house. I kept Arthur's house, which was my house, which the law and my husband agreed was mine. And I gave them back their mother. The piano I kept, but I told Denise that when Emily was grown and had a place for it, it would go to her. Because I taught that child on that bench, and there's no one I'd rather it went to. Denise cried when I said that. I think it was the first moment she let herself remember that I had loved her daughter all along, that I'd been family the whole time, that the gold digger she'd half-talked herself into believing in had just handed her her mother's china and promised her girl the piano. I'm 70 years old, and I still live in the stone house on the hill, with my piano in the front room and the hills turning the colour of a hearth fire every October, the way they have my whole life. And I'll tell you the sweetest thing, the thing I never saw coming through all of it. After 31 years at the church organ, and then 4 years where the only music I made in this world was hymns played soft at a dying man's bedside, I have started to play again. For myself. For no reason but the joy of it, which I had forgotten was a reason. I sat down at that piano the week after Connie Alvarez handed me my life back, and I meant to play for 10 minutes. And I played for 2 hours. Everything. The hard pieces I'd set aside decades ago. And somewhere in the middle of it, I was crying and laughing at the same time. And it was the good kind. The kind that means something in you has come back to life. Arthur would have sat in the doorway and turned my pages. I played for him too. That afternoon, the hymns he courted me with. Play it again, Syl. I did. I do. Emily comes most Saturdays now, 16 and getting truly good. Better than I ever was at her age. And that child and I sit on the bench and make our glorious racket, exactly the way we did when her legs didn't reach the pedals. And Denise comes with her and sits in the front room with a cup of tea and listens. And the three of us are slowly, carefully, becoming something like a family again. The late kind. The kind that arrives long after you'd stopped looking for it. The kind that still counts for everything. Gary, I'm sorry to tell you, has not come around, and may not. That's a grief I carry, because Arthur asked me to be kind to him, and I have tried. And so far, kindness has been met with a closed door. But I keep the door open on my end, because that's what playing it gentle means, and because his father asked me to. And because I understand now that Gary is the most lost of all of us. A man still standing at his mother's grave 30 years later, unable to forgive the world for letting her go. I pray for him. It's the only piece of him he'll still let me hold. People think the cruelest thing is to be cut out of a family by blood, to be told you were never really one of them. And they did tell me that. Carol's children, in my own kitchen, with my husband barely in the ground. But I've come to believe the cruelest lie isn't that one. It's the lie underneath it, the one that nearly had me packing my mother's figurines into a box. The lie that love has to be proven, that a wife is a matter of paperwork and blood and who arrived first. That you can be married to a man for 22 years and hold his hand through 10,000 bad nights and still owe somebody an explanation for why you belong in your own home. You don't. Love is not the one who got there first. Love is the one who stays to the last breath. And no one, not a stepson with a lawyer, not a notepad full of someone else's dishes, not a 60-day notice on your own kitchen table, can take that from the one who actually stayed. So if you are out there tonight being told you were never really family, by people who've decided your love doesn't count because it came late, or came different, or didn't come with the right last name, let me tell you what a stone house and a quiet afternoon in a lawyer's office taught me. Keep your dignity. Keep your music. Keep your house. If a good man had the foresight to make it yours. Hand back what was never yours to keep. And be kinder than they were. Because that's how you win the only way worth winning. And never, ever let anyone tell you that the one who stayed to the end was anything less than the one who loved the most. If this story found you tonight, stay a while and I'll have another for you soon. And tell me down below, have you ever had to prove you belonged somewhere you'd already given your whole heart to? And where in this world are you keeping me company from tonight? I read every single one. Take care of yourself and go play something gentle for somebody you love.